year was 531, and the Roman Empire had been at war with the Sasanian Empire since 526, but neither side had made significant progress in that time. The Romans had won a key victory at the Battle of Dara in 530, but the Sasanians had answered with a victory at the Battle of Callinicum in April of 531, while taking heavy losses. In the spring of 531, Justinian had sent envoys to meet with Kavadh, the Sasanian king, and discuss a possible peace deal. However, with the victory at Callinicum, Kavadh wasn't quite ready to call it quits just yet. The envoys arrived at Edessa, just short of the Roman-Sasanian border, and sent word to Kavadh that they were ready to open discussions. But the king delayed meeting with them, having just ordered an army towards Marderopolis in an attempt to improve his hand. Marderopolis was also just across the border between the two empires, and the Roman garrison there was headed by Bessus, who had been successfully leading raids into Sasanian territory. A siege began, and Procopius says that the Romans held out bravely, but had limited provisions and would need to surrender if they did not get reinforcements and supplies. Knowing that Marderopolis needed help, a Roman army under Sidas approached from the west and made camp about 12 miles from the city, contemplating their next move against a numerically superior force. Simultaneously, a Hunnic force was approaching Marderopolis from the north. This army was coming to support the Sasanians, but they didn't know that. They knew that the army was approaching, but they had fallen victim to a Roman ruse. The Romans had been able to bribe a local Persian to enter the Sasanian camp and inform the besiegers that the Huns had been bought off by Justinian and would be allying with Bessus and his men. And the Sasanians bought it, so they were spooked. Between Sidas and the Huns, they didn't know how to proceed with the siege. They were scared and didn't have a good plan. And then, news came that would change everything. Messengers from the east made it to the Sasanian camp and informed them that Kavadh, the king of the Sasanians, had died at the age of 82, ending a reign of 43 years. Kavadh intended for his son Khosrow to succeed him as king, and even personally crowned him while on his deathbed. But Khosrow's hold on power was not firm, and everyone knew this. He was Kavadh's youngest son, so there would be contenders for the throne. And this put the entire course of the war into question. With all the uncertainty, the army backed off of Marderopolis and returned to Sasanian territory to regroup and get everything figured out. The Huns approached Marderopolis soon after, expecting to link up with the Sasanians. When they couldn't find them around, they just decided to do what Hunnic armies did best. They raised hell in the surrounding area, plundering and looting, until they could be finally driven off by the Romans. Now, remember those envoys over in Edessa? The ones that Kavadh had refused to talk to while the siege of Marderopolis was underway? Well, they were still in Edessa, and Khosrow was very eager to see them. The new king needed to firm up his own position, and he wanted peace with the Romans while he did so. But those envoys now had new orders from the emperor. They were forbidden from crossing into Sasanian territory and entering talks unless Justinian himself gave the go-ahead. Khosrow then wrote to Justinian to ask for the talks to begin, but the emperor replied flatly, "We do not give permission for our ambassadors to come to you, nor do we recognize you as the emperor of the Persians." Justinian knew that Khosrow needed to consolidate power, and he took this opportunity to divide the Sasanians as much as he possibly could. Khosrow's problems stemmed from a few places. As I mentioned, he was the youngest son of the former king. He was also reform-minded, as his father had been, and the aristocracy never really likes that sort of thing. There were also some religious issues at play between different branches of Zoroastrianism. So just to keep this short and simple, we can sum it up with other people wanted different things. Kavadh's oldest son tried to claim the throne for himself, but he didn't receive much support from the nobility. There was, however, a major effort to place Zamasp, the second oldest son, on the throne. Now, real quick, I don't think I've ever heard Zamasp's name pronounced out loud. I've seen it written tons of times, but I'm kind of flying blind here when it comes to the pronunciation. I hope I'm saying it right, but there's a pretty good chance that I'm not, so sorry about that. Anyway, Zamasp was blind in one eye, and under Sasanian law, this disqualified him from becoming king. But he had a son, named Kavadh, who could theoretically rule just fine once he came of age. So if this Kavadh could be placed on the throne to succeed his grandfather, Kavadh, then Zamasp could rule as regent until Kavadh was old enough to take the reins for himself. So a conspiracy was hatched among some members of the aristocracy to assassinate Khosrow and install the newer, younger, hipper Kavadh as the successor to the dead and decaying Kavadh. However, before the plan could be put into motion, someone let the cat out of the bag and word got back to Khosrow that his life was in danger. And the king took swift action. He had everyone involved with the plot put to death, including Zamasp. He also ordered that Kavadh, his own nephew, be executed. But there was one hitch here. Kavadh was being raised by a guardian away from the royal court, while his father tended to the empire's business. These guardians could not bring themselves to kill the young boy. They told Khosrow that they had carried out the orders, but they actually hid Kavadh, raising him in secret. And they were quite successful. Khosrow would not learn of this plot until 541, and he would have the guardians put to death for it. But he never found Kavadh, who had been given a large sum of cash and sent off into hiding. Not long after the guardians were put to death, a man claiming to be Kavadh, who apparently greatly resembled his grandfather, appeared in Constantinople. He was received by Justinian and honored as the grandson of the late Sasanian king. I don't know if it actually was him or not, but I'm choosing to believe that it was, because I think that story's pretty cool. Now, back in 532, while Khosrow was taking care of his own business in his empire, Justinian ran into some problems of his own. In January of 532, the Nika riots began in Constantinople, and the city suffered heavy damages and saw thousands of deaths. Justinian too now needed to worry about losing his grip on power, so the Romans were now also eager to negotiate. Justinian's ambassadors met with Khosrow in the spring of 532, and Khosrow asked the Romans to make a few concessions. For one, he wanted their military command post in Mesopotamia moved away from Dara, which was close to the border, and installed at Constantina, a little further into Roman territory. The king felt that this would alleviate some of the pressure on the border. He also demanded that 110 centenaria, or roughly 11,000 pounds of gold, be paid to him as tribute. And on top of that, he demanded that some forts along the border in the north be returned to the Sasanians, while also refusing to give up the forts that he had taken control of up in Lazica. Lazica was this region here. It was a kingdom with some degree of independence, but it was a Roman client state through much of late antiquity. But the Sasanians wanted it under their sphere of influence, so Khosrow really liked having control there. These were sort of harsh terms, but the Romans were willing to accept them. The only hitch was that the envoys needed Justinian's personal approval to return the forts to Khosrow. So one of the ambassadors, Rufinus, hurried back west to get the emperor's go-ahead. Rufinus presented the plan to Justinian, who signed off on the deal. But before the ambassador could return to the east, a rumor reached Khosrow that Justinian had not only rejected the deal, but was so enraged by the terms that he had put Rufinus to death for it. Khosrow, thinking that this meant the war was still on and that the peace talks had broken down, began to amass his army on the border and made plans to move into Roman territory. Luckily, though, the not-dead Rufinus made it all the way back to Nisibis and was able to meet with Khosrow before the hostilities could restart. He even offered a portion of the agreed-upon gold to the king so that things could cool down. However, not long after Rufinus arrived in Nisibis, another messenger from Constantinople arrived. It turned out that shortly after sending Rufinus back to the east, Justinian had experienced a change of heart, and he was now vehemently opposed to this peace deal, mainly on the grounds that he was surrendering forts that he had won, while Khosrow was not doing the same. And Khosrow was prepared to call off the negotiations. Again. However, since Rufinus had already given the king some of the promised gold, he knew that he would be in big trouble if he told Justinian that he surrendered payment without actually getting a peace deal. So the ambassador threw himself at the king's feet and begged Khosrow to return the payment that had already been made, and also pleaded with him not to immediately invade Roman territory. And amazingly, Khosrow agreed to this. He still needed to finish firming up power, and he probably didn't want to restart the war completely, but he wanted the threat there. The talks did continue through the summer of 532, and the two sides were eventually able to reach an agreement. All the forts captured during the war would be returned to the other side, meaning the Sasanians would get back the forts that Khosrow wanted, and the Romans would maintain Lazica. Also, the 11,000 pounds of gold would still be given to Khosrow. In the treaty, both Justinian and Khosrow agreed that they were brothers, and pledged military and financial support to each other. The treaty that the men signed was known as the Treaty of Perpetual Peace, but I've also seen it translated into English as the Treaty of Endless Peace and the Treaty of Eternal Peace. Of course, none of those names are actually accurate, but you get the idea of how they perceived it at the time. With peace secured in the east, Justinian turned his eyes to the west and began his quest to bring the former Roman territories back into his empire. After Belisarius conquered the Vandals in 533 and 534, Khosrow sent envoys to Constantinople to congratulate Justinian on his success in Africa. The envoys jokingly told Justinian that Khosrow should receive a share of the spoils from the Vandal kingdom because the emperor would never have been able to conquer that territory had the Sasanians not granted him peace in 532. Justinian did give these envoys a small payment of gold for Khosrow, and then dismissed them from Constantinople. The message here, though, was pretty clear. Khosrow knew that he posed a threat not just to the Roman eastern frontier, but to Justinian's entire policy in the west. As the 530s progressed and Khosrow consolidated power, he began to regret signing the treaty. He could see Justinian getting stronger and wealthier, largely because the peace deal had allowed him to turn his attention away from the Sasanians. And Khosrow did not like his rival getting stronger and wealthier. By the end of the decade, he no longer needed peace, but Justinian very much did. And the emperor was continuing to take soldiers and resources away from his eastern border, making it a juicier target for the Sasanians. At the end of the decade, Khosrow was getting antsy and looking for any justification he could find to break the Treaty of Perpetual Peace. In 539, he very nearly found this justification over a border dispute between two Arab kingdoms, the Lakhmids, who were a Sasanian client state, and the Ghassanids, who were a Roman client state. The stretch of land that was under dispute was pretty barren, according to Procopius, and local authorities told Justinian that it would be better to simply cede the land than risk war with the Sasanians over it. But Khosrow alleged that a Roman envoy had tried to bribe the Lakhmids during the negotiations, and also claimed that the Romans were simultaneously attempting to convince the Huns to attack Sasanian territory. These accusations were brought before Justinian sometime in 539, which is why the emperor was so eager to end the war in Italy immediately, despite Belisarius being on the verge of total victory. It was also around this time in 539 that an Ostrogothic delegation had slipped away from Italy and made it all the way to Ctesiphon. This delegation was a bit of a Hail Mary from Vitiges, the Ostrogothic king. Vitiges knew that he did not have a chance at preserving his kingdom unless the Romans were forced to pull men out of Italy and defend against Khosrow. The Ostrogothic delegation told Khosrow that if Justinian were successful in the west, he would surely use the resources of his new territories to wage war in the east. And it almost certainly didn't take much to convince Khosrow of this. He knew what westward expansion meant for Justinian's empire, and he didn't like it one bit. But with these envoys now telling him that Ostrogothic Italy was on the brink of total defeat, Khosrow knew that it was now or never. So in May of 540, Khosrow had seen enough. His army crossed the border and entered Roman territory. The Treaty of Perpetual Peace had lasted just short of 8 years. The Romans and the Sasanians were once again at war.